To the left, we have the 65-inch Sony X80K. To the right, we have the LG C1. Now, I don't have to tell anybody this, but it is an absolute domination and slaughter on the X80K by the LG C1. The C1 overall is pretty much the absolute bee's knees of a TV. It's still the best TV I've ever seen to this day. So I don't know if anyone was expecting this to truly go in favor of the X80K. But we're going to do an unfair comparison to kind of talk about what you are and are not going to be getting. So smack a like on this video for, again, considering this aspect when talking about consumer products, because many people just think that, just go for the most expensive thing just because it's expensive, and I want to talk about what you're gaining and what you're not getting. Okay, so in terms of brightness, I would say that they actually are pretty comparable from a brightness perspective. As you can see, the LG C1's not inherently leaving the Sony behind to a great degree. And again, that's because they're pretty similar. And in fact, in many examples, I see the Sony having a little bit more global brightness or full screen brightness than what the LG C1 is consistently kicking out. So that's good stuff there. But of course, as we know, you're going to miss out on things like clarity and contrast. And this is where it starts to become a tale of the tape of, well, LG is just hitting harder. But that doesn't mean that Sony is doing bad. I'm actually going to pause here and I want to show you this because this shows the shadow detail capabilities of this particular Sony. What is so impressive here is that you have basically the same amount of shadow detail that you have on the LG on the Sony. And as I look at it with my naked eye looking here, I've really got a hunt for where the LG is better. So again, it's not like the LG is just gonna absolutely destroy everything Sony has to offer. And then of course, if we look at the highlight is actually stronger on the Sony, where LG is, again, not as strong with the highlight placement. So again, that's something that I think is really cool to see, that a budget TV is capable of producing this level of image quality for this price point. Now, I actually also want to pause here because this is one of the better images to show off. I mean, this is kind of where you see a big difference here. Now, if the colors on camera appear off or skewed or anything weird like that, you're just going to have to take my word for it. It doesn't look that way in real life. But what I can tell you is the amount of detail that you're getting on both TVs is pretty impressive. And actually, they're pretty identical at first glance. You've really got to sit there again and pixel peep to notice that the C1 is sharper and has more clarity. This speaks volumes to the rendering that Sony is doing on their X1 4K HDR processor, a processing chip from 2017 brought back in 2022. But they're making refinements and it does look really good. When we look at images like this, as I look at the colors, the C1 is richer, deeper, and has more three-dimensionality, depth, and draw. Of course. But then we look over at the Sony, and the Sony isn't too far behind. And now again, it's not going to be an equal, but it's also not being left in the dust. Now this is important to note because you aren't paying as much as you're paying for the C1 for this Sony. And I think, again, that's something we need to talk about when we're looking at these two displays. I mean, in every example that I can see, obviously it's going to be a win for the LG C1 overall, but when you really start to look at the images for what they are and for what they cost, Sony is hitting well above its weight as far as contrast in many areas. Again, that's not across the entire plane, but it's definitely something to think about. Now, one of the things that really impressed me was this particular example, because you can see that the highlight placement is pretty much identical to what we have with LG, with a couple nuances from each manufacturer. Now, again, LG has more dimensionality and overall, of course, slaughtering the Sony, but we can appreciate what Sony is doing right. And again, seeing that the Sony is also capable of rendering this level of three-dimensionality and depth out of their image is huge, because this is their entry-most television, which gives me hope for the re-optimization, I should say, of the XR chipset. So again, it's one of those things where it's like, as we look at each scene, we're going to notice a lot of differences. But I mean, the three-dimensionality even on this image is pretty incredible. So now let's take a look at some anime type content and see what those differences are. Looking at something like My Hero Academia, you can see a lot of detail off of the C1. That's a given. But Sony, again, is still giving you a pretty good amount of detail. The clarity is not as good, but it's good for a budget TV. Now, what really impressed me was the highlight mapping of this TV, and you can clearly see it here in this example. Notice how the flames coming out of Endeavor's elbows are really bright, where on the C1 you just have a lot more detail, and their highlights are good, but they're just getting absolutely slaughtered in the highlight detail with the X80K. And this is one of the advantages of LED. But more impressively, even though this is Sony's budget TV, this is what I was talking about earlier on where I said highlight placement is intelligently rendered. They are finding key areas where a highlight will pop off, and they are illuminating just that part, not really focusing on the full screen brightness so much as that one little area and really giving it that extra kick. Now again, it's not a local dimming television, so the effect won't be as exaggerated, but it's still something I am able to pick up on. Look at the explosion here, and you can kind of see the difference between the two technologies. Now, the C1 at a glance, as I look at it with my naked eye, is the dimmer TV. However, Sony is still doing a great job of providing a great image as far as brightness, and the C1 is keeping up as well in that regard as far as, you know, everything looking good. But again, Sony is the brighter TV, and again, I don't think anybody expected that to go any other way. Now, images like this, where we have a well-lit scene, it's pretty bright. This is where it was actually a little disappointing for me comparing against the C1. I kind of expected Sony to pull ahead a lot more than they did, and the C1 is an absolute monster in this category and in this area, and frankly, it's like, why even watch the X80K by comparison? So that was something that really kind of bugged me a little bit. But again, when you get to rich highlight moments like this, you kind of forgive all that and kind of come back to reality and realize that, yes, it's a budget TV. No, it's not going to give you OLED picture quality, but you are getting some aspects that are nice to have that even, I wouldn't say approaches OLED level, but definitely hits well above its weight. Now, this is where you're going to find the biggest disappointment, black levels. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open up my ISO here just so you guys can see what this is. Now, for those who are kind of new to camera jargon, ISO is your sensitivity to light so that we can let more detail in. It'll be very apparent. You can see it pretty much immediately. I don't even have to go too far. I'm at ISO 640. And you can clearly see that there's all kinds of gray-black going on here. It's just ugly, really, by comparison to the LG, which is obviously self-emissive. So in a dark room like what I'm in right now, you are going to experience a pretty big difference in terms of brightness. Not brightness, but black uniformity. And the brightness is kind of being a little bit more of a hindrance on scenes like this where you have a big bright explosion on a black background. You don't have local dimming to offset that on this set, so that's something that's going to really affect you. Now, again, if I wanted to, I could be like some other YouTubers and just kind of put it all the way down here and be like, you see, it's inky deep black, it's an OLED, it's absolutely fantastic, you don't need OLED. People like doing that too, and I don't know why people like playing those kind of ISO tricks. This is as real as it gets, and I do want to represent that part of it as well. But now check this image out. This is where the X80K blows my mind, okay? It's the highlight rendering on things like those embers around Kachan. If you don't know that character, he's just the one right over here. This little ember right here is absolutely freaking insane. It's just luminous, very rich, very punchy, very poppy, and you see a ton of detail. Now, of course, looking over at the C1, it is incredible. But the biggest downside with the C1 is it has something called gradual ABL. And what that means is the longer an image sits on the screen, the dimmer it gets. So it's hard because when you pop over to images like this, initially it'll be a little brighter, but then it'll sink down in brightness, so you won't get the same effect. So if a scene sits kind of stagnant for too long on like very similar geometry, your TV is just going to start dimming, where again, LED doesn't really have that problem, and I think that's something that's very important. I mean, every highlight coming off of this TV right now with the Sony X80K is impressive, and actually more impressive than what we have right now on the LG C1 as far as a highlight perspective goes. So I think the message is very clear, right? If you're somebody that is looking to save some money, I mean, these images are very different. They do very different things. It's very clear that OLED is definitely dominating. However, when you look at the overall offering, it's pretty impressive because the three-dimensionality is clearly there and it holds its own, I would like to say, fairly well in many aspects of depth compared to an OLED. Now again, it's not going to be a like-for-like match and you can't really hope for that or expect that, but I think all in all, this is a win for budget consumers because again, you're not paying OLED pricing And especially if you go for a smaller size, the pixel density will be tighter, meaning your image will be clearer. And so to have this level of highlight mapping and things like that, I think that's just incredible. So obviously the winner is the LG C1, but I would say that it is an impressive fight and showing for the X80K, and they held in there and they did their thing. A lot of bright highlights, as you are clearly seeing, and it is something that is really wonderful to see at this price range. But that being said, I want to thank you guys so much for watching the #1 brand in honesty. Keep it locked for more awesome comparisons and my final review of this, and later on, a new 2022 television that we will be unveiling. Until the next video, I'll see you guys later.